This section opens the book's argument by way of a single life. Vera outlived herself. The vibrant woman was gone nearly a decade before her body stopped. That gap is the whole argument in miniature. Lifespan and healthspan are distinct variables, and we have fused them into one sentence we never chose to read. The chapter's work is to pry loose a single axiom, the clock is ticking, by exposing it as contingent, a fact of circumstance that can be changed rather than a fixed law. Aging gets reframed from the fixed backdrop against which a life happens into a treatable condition, the most common disease. No biology is spent here. The introduction only loosens the reader's certainty so that the mechanism the book will later supply has somewhere to land. Predict the rest from that one inversion. Constant becomes variable. This section lays out the two distinctions the introduction opens with and why together they dismantle the fatalist case against defeating aging. Every fatalist argument against defeating aging conflates two quantities that the introduction preys apart. Human life expectancy rose across millennia, but always from below. Infant mortality fell. The average was dragged upward, while the ceiling near 115 never moved. Sinclair's move is to deny that the constancy of that ceiling is a law, rather than an unexamined regularity. No biology mandates aging. The second cut separates length from vitality. Vera's 92 years ended in a decade of frailty, and the resigned verdict was that this is just the way it goes. The book exists to attack that resignation. It reframes aging as the most common disease, and it holds that gains in lifespan are worthless unless they are carried by rising healthspan. The Wright brothers, before liftoff, are the same move. Absence of precedent is not a law. This part explains why aging and survival share a single cause. Aging has one origin, and it is the very mechanism that keeps you alive. Sinclair's origin fable, Magna Superstes, the great survivor, installs one gene circuit at the root of life. Gene A halts reproduction under stress. Gene B silences A when times are good, but it abandons that post to repair broken DNA, which reactivates A. The cell pauses, mends itself, survives. Every living thing inherits this loop, unchanged for 4 billion years. Here is the step that makes the whole thing turn. The repair signal is borrowed from the reproduction silencer, so every genomic crisis pulls the same protein away from its day job. That borrowing is survival at short range and aging at long. One mechanism, opposite verdicts across timescales. This section explains the central bet of the book's opening chapter, that aging has a single cause. Aging has one cause, not many. Sinclair's whole book turns on that singular article, and this opening chapter plants it as a structural bet. Every living thing inherits a single survival circuit from an imagined ancestor, Magna Superstes, the great survivor. Here is how the circuit works. Gene A halts reproduction under stress. Gene B carries a silencer that normally frees Gene A to run. But the mutation the whole scheme depends on makes that same silencer double as a DNA repair crew. When the genome breaks, the silencer abandons its regulatory post to go patch the damage, and the cell hunkers down until repair is done. The primitive to carry forward is this. Aging is one adaptive loop, built over time. Stored damage piling up is the picture this replaces. The mechanism that guarantees survival is, run long enough, the very mechanism that ages you. This part explains why two cells with the same genes can become completely different tissues, and what that tells us about aging. The genome is a piano. The epigenome is the pianist. Every cell holds the same 20,000 keys, yet a nerve cell differs from a skin cell entirely by how those keys are played, which genes are revealed, and which are bundled into silence by methyl and acetyl tags. This inverts the reflex that DNA is destiny. Identical twins age apart. One smoker's face slackens while the other's holds, on the same underlying code. The step that carries the whole argument is Sinclair's information theory of aging. We age because the pianist, harassed by DNA damage, starts striking wrong notes, while the piano itself stays intact. The corruption is analog in the reading, rather than digital in the text. Every hallmark of aging, gray hair, senescence, telomere loss, becomes one downstream symptom of the same cause, accumulating epigenetic noise. This section explains why aging is a matter of information rather than of broken genes. Aging is information going quiet. The intuition that some gene has failed misses what is actually happening. Sinclair splits the cell into two registers. The digital genome is the score. The analog epigenome is the pianist reading it. Aging lives entirely in the second register. Digital data survive, copying intact. Analog data accumulate noise, and it is that noise, not any mutation, that makes an old cell forget which cell it is. Hence the demented pianist. The piano is sound. The composer's notes are intact, but the player has begun missing keys. Predict the rest. No single aging gene exists to find. Repair means restoring the reading, never rewriting the code. This section explains why aging goes unfought as a driver of disease. Aging is the largest cause of the illnesses we fight hardest: cancer, heart disease, and dementia. Yet it appears on no death certificate and holds no ICD code, so nothing targets it. That gap is the chapter itself. The epidemic is blind because our classification of death has no slot for its upstream driver, and effort flows only where a cause is named. Sinclair's single move is to relocate aging from the fixed backdrop of life into the category of disease. This is the reclassification that the 2010 Royal Society gathering converged on. The primitive is this: a dominant cause stays unfought for want of a name, even when its magnitude is enormous. The ontology of the map decides where the battle happens, not the ontology of the territory. This section reclassifies aging from a constant into a variable. Medicine treats aging as the fixed background. You subtract before naming the real cause: cancer, heart disease, dementia, and then it fights each leaf in its own building. But the leaves share one root. That root is an exponential clock, named after Gompertz, and it multiplies your odds of every lethal disease 1,000-fold between the ages of 20 and 70. Cure any single one of those diseases and you buy almost nothing. Remove all cardiovascular disease and you add 1.5 years. Remove all cancer and you add 2.1. The multiplier keeps climbing regardless. So name the root itself the disease and dam it at the source, rather than building 9 dams on 9 tributaries. Only an arbitrary 50% prevalence line keeps aging filed under inevitable rather than treatable. This part explains why longevity is something you can begin now. The machinery is already inside you, and the whole move of the chapter is that you needn't wait for the pharmacology coming later in the book to switch it on. One primitive does all the work, adversity without damage. Hunger, not starvation, stress held on the razor's edge, calorie restriction, intermittent fasting, the Blue Zone's lean plates, Cornaro's 12 daily ounces. These are not separate prescriptions. They are a single input to the survival circuit from the earlier chapters, the primordial program that reads scarcity as a cue to defend the cell and defer aging. This is hormesis. What fails to kill you tells your longevity genes to go to work. You can predict the next instance yourself. Any mild, recoverable stress trips the same switch. This section explains the single switch under every recommendation in this chapter. That switch is hormesis, sublethal adversity that the cell reads as a signal to defend itself. Sinclair's thesis is that the survival circuit built for scarcity does not care which scarcity it faces. Calorie restriction, intermittent fasting, protein and amino acid limitation, exercise, cold, and heat all converge on one downstream move: AMPK up, mTOR down, NAD and sirtuins engaged. So you can generate the next instance yourself. Any mild one that stops short of harm turns these genes on. The boundary is the sign of the stress. Signaling adversity mobilizes the defenders. Gross DNA damage, smoke, radiation, and nitrosamines conscript those same sirtuins into repair and drag them off their posts, accelerating what the mild dose delays. This section explains the single trick behind every longevity drug in this chapter. Every one of them is a lie the body believes. Rapamycin, metformin, and resveratrol each grip. A different handle on one ancient machine, TOR, AMPK, and the sirtuins, and each forges the molecular signal of hardship, scarcity, stress, a starving signal of hardship, scarcity, stress, a starving and repair, even though no real adversity ever arrives. That is the whole primitive adversity mimicry. Instead of repairing aging, you impersonate the famine that makes cells maintain themselves. None of them is a cure. Each buys years by faking the stimulus that the survival circuit from Chapter 2 evolved to answer. The surprise, Sinclair's soft petals, is that these are not tomorrow's molecules. Metformin and rapamycin are cheap and generic, already coursing through millions of bloodstreams. The first pill is old. This section explains how adversity produces longevity by tripping a sensor rather than extending life directly. Adversity never extended life on its own. It only tripped a sensor. Calorie restriction, cold, and exercise each converge on 3 molecular switches, mTOR, AMPK, and sirtuins, that read scarcity and flip the body into repair, and sirtuins, that read scarcity and flip the body into repair and conserve mode. The chapter's move is decoupling. If the benefit lives in the switch and not in the suffering, then any molecule that throws the switch inherits the benefit. Rapamycin, metformin, resveratrol, and NAD boosters are each a hand on a different lever, mimicking hunger without hunger. This is what converts the survival circuit from a phenomenon you must earn through hardship into a drug target you can simply address. The pill introduces no new mechanism. It is the old mechanism, pulled deliberately. This part lays out the spine of the aging argument and the ladder of near-term interventions that follows from it. Aging looks intractable only while you count its symptoms. Collapse them into one upstream cause, and the whole thing turns easy, easier than cancer, Sinclair insists, because you strike a single regulator rather than 1,000 downstream failures. That inversion is the chapter's spine. From it, the near-term interventions form a ladder climbing upstream. First, kill the senescent zombie cells with senolytics, then vaccinate against their appearance, then reset the epigenetic clock outright by reprogramming. Each rung sits nearer the source, so each one buys more. The generative move is to subsume many diseases under one lever. It is the same move soap and vaccines already made. Once you understand what the problem is, it becomes easy to solve. This section lays out the single axis that organizes every anti-aging therapy. There is one disease and one axis. Once you see aging as a single upstream cause, the youthful information lost from the epigenome, while the DNA sequence itself stays intact, every therapy sorts by how far up that axis it reaches. Senolytics burn out the zombie cells. Retrotransposon leashes and anti-senescence vaccines catch the leak nearer the source. Each of these only palliates. The turn of the chapter is that the blueprint survives intact. Dolly proved that old DNA still holds the young message. So the deepest move is to reread. Repair only patches the damage. Rereading recovers what was lost. Picture a scratched DVD. The digital pits that hold the data endure. Only the analog reader stumbles over the scratches. So you polish the disc back to readable, and you never replace it. That reframing is the pivot of the whole book. It moves from slowing aging to reversing it, from fighting damage to restoring lost information. This section explains the shift that opens the age of innovation in medicine. For most of its history, medicine has run on the mode. It treats each patient as the population's most likely case, what works for most people most of the time. Boguski's puncture is simple. Not everyone is most people. The chapter's move is to replace the categorical proxy with the generative signature. Diagnosing cancer by where it sits in the body is like calling a whale a fish because it lives in water. DNA sequencing reads the actual thing. Kuhn Lewin carried leukemia that was treated as lung cancer until her genome was read. You might expect the innovation to be new drugs. It is instead the collapse of the distance between the average and the individual. Cheap sequencing, wearables, and AI turning population medicine into a readout of you. This section explains Chapter 8's central move, treating molecular identity as the real target of medicine. Modern medicine treats the proxy as the target, where a tumor sits, what a symptom looks like, what works for most people most of the time. Chapter 8's move is to collapse that proxy, to read the molecular identity directly, and the average dissolves that proxy, to read the molecular identity directly, and the average dissolves into the individual. Kuhn Lewin, treated for lung cancer, actually carried leukemia growing in her lung. Location lied, and the genome told the truth. Cheap sequencing, wearables, and AI turn the population's statistical guess into a personal measurement. A whale is a fish because they both live in water. That is the error precision. Medicine ends. In the book's arc, this is where the aging mechanism stops being theory and becomes something instrumented, individualized, and actionable, treatment keyed to what a thing is, rather than where it was found. This section lays out the structural primitive behind the chapter's forecast. A stack of independent conservative gains, earlier diagnosis, caloric restraint, survival circuit molecules, epigenetic reset. Even the pessimistic addition lands past 113 years. That arithmetic is the chapter's decoy. The real primitive is the fixed point. Once each month you survive buys more than a month of future lifespan, the sum diverges. This is longevity, escape velocity, the forecasting error. The chapter attacks is linear extrapolation over a multiplicative process. Knowledge compounds, technology synergize, so experts get blindsided precisely where the curve bends, as Michelson was, as Gates was on the internet. If the information theory of aging holds, the epigenome resets in perpetuity and no upper bound survives. Part 3 opens here. The mechanism chapters become a trajectory, and its asymptote is the surprise. This part of the book is its hinge, Part 3, where mechanism gives way to consequence. Having argued that aging can be defeated, Sinclair now turns to whether it should. The whole chapter runs on one correction applied twice. The pessimist extrapolates linearly. More people, more consumption, Malthusian collapse. Fenner put it starkly, that humanity would be gone in 100 years. Sinclair's reply is structural rather than a mirror image optimism. The point is the shape of the reasoning. Knowledge is multiplicative, technologies are synergistic, so linear extrapolation of a compounding process always undershoots, and it undershoots in both directions. His own year-by-year arithmetic, carried out to 113, is deliberately conservative, precisely because the real dynamics are exponential. The work of the chapter is to license the ethical questions, equity, overpopulation, and meaning that the science has now made unavoidable. This section explains how Sinclair ends his book and why the ending is a redefinition rather than another molecule. Sinclair closes the book with a definition. After a whole book of molecules, the final chapter turns on a single speech act. Aging is a disease. Nothing in the biology changes. What changes is a category boundary. Because public research money is bound to the word disease, moving aging inside that boundary redistributes billions of dollars without a single new experiment. The lever here is classificatory. It works by reclassification, not by any new science. His futurism is scaffolding for this one claim. The first 125-year-old is an outlier and then becomes unremarkable. Since the science is already inevitable, the remaining variable is institutional, who funds it, who benefits, and whether longevity widens inequality or funds a shared prosperity. The work of the chapter is to relocate the fight from the lab to the definition. This section marks a turning point in the argument. For 9 chapters, the claim was that aging is malleable. Here the frame shifts. The obstacle has moved. For those 9 chapters, it was biology, and now it is classification. The entire research apparatus, the NIH grants, the drug approval pathways, the queue of talent, gates on a single question of type membership, is this thing a disease? Aging sits outside that type, so it starves on under 1% of the budget, even though it disables 93% of the old. Sinclair's whole path forward reduces to one relabeling. In Chapter 10, the move is define aging as a disease and nothing else needs to change. There is no new mechanism here. You flip one predicate and the machinery already built reorients itself, with funding and regulation and competition following automatically. Australia's approval route, the one for modifying a physiological process, is that reclassification already leaking through. The lever is definitional. The technical apparatus is already standing, waiting only for the category to change. This section explains why the book's final chapter proves nothing and instead counts. Having argued across the whole book that aging is a treatable disease, Sinclair closes with a census rather than a final proof. He walks through his Harvard lab, name by name, then the dozen centers beyond it. The reason is that the claim carrying the ending has become sociological rather than biological. Inevitability is manufactured by momentum. When enough brilliant people converge on a problem, the outcome stops being a hypothesis and becomes a trajectory. The tell is institutional. The World Health Organization's ICD-11 now carries a diagnostic code MG2A, under which old age is a diagnosable disease. That is a fact about institutions arrived at without a single new experiment. The final descent runs from the global army of researchers to his own lab, to his own daily regimen. It is one move at 3 scales, the thesis made flesh in a single body. This section explains how the book's final chapter turns a laboratory possibility into an unstoppable movement. The whole book argues that aging is one treatable condition, and the conclusion supplies the phase transition, the shift from something that could be done in a lab to something already underway, distributed and unstoppable. The step that does the work here is a definition, not a molecule. The World Health Organization's ICD-11 code, MG2A, quietly reclassifies old age as a disease. Once the category flips, funding, regulation, and the moral calculus all reorient downstream from it. So the real bottleneck was categorical. The science was not the obstacle. This is why Leon Kass, in Beyond Therapy, fought the definition and never the science, because the definition is the lever that moves everything else. The book opened on inevitability, a grandmother's decline, and it closes by negating that opening. Nothing is inevitable.